In the Masai Mara Reserve in southwestern Kenya, a mother and her cub had been separated from their pride for months. The lioness was concerned because she had a young cub that had just been born. Even before the cub was born, the lioness felt threatened by the male lions in the pride. Because of this, the lioness decided to leave the pride to protect and raise her cub in the safest way possible. The day the lioness left the pride, the sky was filled with golden sunlight over the vast grasslands. The cub found a relatively quiet patch of grass to use as a temporary shelter. However, the African savanna also has countless invisible threats. From competing predators to extreme weather dangers, anything can pose a risk to lion cubs. The lioness was always on high alert, keeping her eyes constantly vigilant as she moved over every hill. As the days went on, mother and cub did not stay in one place. By continuously moving, they could avoid conflicts with other lion prides. The steppe is lush and green after the dry season, but also full of uncertainty due to strong winds. The cub was too young to recognize any danger. It was simply busy running and exploring the surroundings. Occasionally, the lioness would softly roar, calling her cub back to her side. But the cub's courage pushed it to venture further each day. In 2022, the rainy season brought dark clouds and thunderstorms. It rained almost continuously for 5 days. The small stream, which used to flow gently and where the cubs often bathed and played, gradually transformed into a raging flood. The water rose high, rushing swiftly, creating white foam caps, carrying branches and small stones along the way. Despite the strength of the water, the cub remained unaware of the danger. It skipped around the stream, enjoying the view of the flowing water. The lioness was always nearby, watching over her cub in case any unforeseen situation arose. However, in a moment of inattention, the lioness turned her head, looking for a drier place to shelter. Meanwhile, the cub accidentally slipped into the deep water. The strong current quickly swept the cub away from the bank. The lioness turned her head and was immediately startled when she saw her cub being swept away by the violent water. She ran, roaring loudly along the stream, hoping to save her cub, but was utterly powerless. Her claws dug into the wet earth, her eyes filled with fear and despair. The agonizing roars echoed through the air, drowning out the sound of the pouring rain. In the torrential rain, the lioness could only cry, watching as her cub slowly disappeared. At that moment, 2 reserve patrol officers, Mark and James, were driving by. They had been instructed to regularly monitor the area during heavy, prolonged rainfall and report the situation quickly. From a distance, they heard a deafening roar and knew something was wrong. Mark and James stopped the vehicle, put on their raincoats, and ran toward the loud sound. What they saw was a lioness running along the riverbank, roaring in pain. Not far from her, they saw a lion cub being swept away by the raging water. James realized there was an emergency and discussed a rescue plan with Mark. They quickly grabbed a long rope from the rescue kit in the car. The plan was for one person to tie the rope around themselves, swim into the water to stop the cub, while the other would stay on the bank to hold the rope. Mark volunteered to swim into the water while James stayed behind to hold the rope and prepare to pull. It was raining heavily and the water was flowing fast, but Mark was determined not to hesitate. He took a deep breath, tied the rope securely around his waist, and jumped into the icy water. The strength of the current made every movement difficult. Mark swam through the current, feeling as though he could be swept away at any moment. On the shore, James held the rope tightly, keeping his eyes on his teammate. The lioness kept roaring, her eyes radiating faint hope. Mark gritted his teeth and pushed on until he finally reached the cub. He saw that the cub was exhausted, its legs limp in the water. With great effort, Mark stretched out his hand and grabbed the cub. It seemed as though the floodwater was starting to recede, but he held firm and didn't let go. Mark shouted to James, signaling that he needed to pull the rope. James pulled hard, inch by inch, bringing Mark and the cub closer to shore. With each meter, the tension in everyone's heart grew. The cold rain, combined with the strong current, made Mark's body almost numb. But the fact that the cub was safe was the biggest motivation for him to not give up. Finally, the two reached the shore and collapsed onto the muddy ground. The cub lay panting and shivering in Mark's arms. When the lioness saw this, she immediately began to roar and ran toward her cub. James and Mark looked at each other, fearful that the lioness might be angry that her cub had been touched by a human. However, they quickly checked the cub's condition. Fortunately, the cub had no serious injuries, only exhaustion from near drowning. As the lioness approached, Mark gently placed the cub in front of him. This gesture served as confirmation that they did not intend to harm. The lioness lowered her head and licked her cub, checking every scratch on its young body. The cub licked vigorously at its wet fur, trying to warm up. Between roars, the lioness sniffed the scent of her cub, as if checking if it was safe. Mark and James backed away, still holding onto the rope. Their hearts raced as they wondered if the lioness would consider them enemies. Suddenly, the lioness raised her head and stared directly at the two men, as though she wanted to communicate something. She didn't roar threateningly, but squinted her eyes and growled softly. It seemed like a sound of relief and gratitude. James grinned, relieved that they were spared from further danger. Mark pulled a towel from his pocket and quickly dried the cub. He then grabbed a box of leftover meat from the car and opened it to offer it to the lioness and her cub. The lioness had a sharp sense of smell. She walked closer, sniffed the meat box, and took a small bite. The cub was hungry too, so it followed its mother and ate eagerly. When the lioness finished the meat, she licked her lips and looked at Mark and James. The gesture was like a sincere thank you from the wilderness. Mark took a deep breath and slowly raised his hand to stroke the lioness's head. The animal didn't seem aggressive, but tilted her head, allowing her wet fur to brush against his hand. At that moment, all boundaries seemed to fade in the rain of the tropical forest. A moment later, the rain stopped, and the sky suddenly cleared. The lioness seemed to realize that the stream carried many dangers. Therefore, she gave her cub a signal to leave. The cub turned its head toward the two men and blinked its innocent eyes. Mother and cub slowly turned and walked across the wet grass, heading toward the distant grasslands. Mark and James watched, relieved and happy that they had saved a life. They stood there for a moment to ensure that the lioness and her cub would not face further problems. Then Mark took out his radio and reported the flood situation in the reserve and the rare rescue operation. James started the car, and they prepared to continue their patrol in the rain and wind. They both knew that more challenges awaited them, but the joy of today would motivate them. On the wet ground, the footprints of the lioness and her cub gradually disappeared, leaving behind an extraordinary story of courage and kindness. Thank you, dear friend, for taking the time to follow the story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to support us.